Hi everybody. So in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about some literary key terms. A lot of these key terms are probably review for you, but it's a good idea to review them and make sure that you're sort of familiar with the definition of them and can maybe explain in your own words what each of these key terms means. We'll be also using these key terms repeatedly over the course, and especially in our study of short fiction. There'll be other key terms introduced as the course goes on. And I have on the course homepage a key term sort of inventory of all of the main key terms that we're going to be doing over the course of the term. So it's a good idea to just sort of familiarize yourself with some of these terms and make note of any that are listed in or on the course homepage. So for our purposes, let's just review some of these basic ones. So character and characterization, protagonist, antagonist, setting, genre, allegory, theme, conflict, symbolism, and plot. So these are some key terms of fiction. We sometimes call these literary devices, but I'm going to call them key concepts or key terms. So the first one here is character. So in every literary fictional story, you have characters, and a character can be a person, it can be an animal, it could be a thing, depends on, what is the story is about. So it's the main speaking parts occupied by a person or thing in a story. And you can have major and minor characters within a story. So a major character would be your protagonist, the heroic leading character. And then minor characters might be, just a side part played by, a friend or acquaintance, or they have a small role or very few speaking parts in the narrative. And characters are the ones that do the actions, have conflicts. They're the ones that, the conflict happens to. And they are the ones that sort of fuel the story going forward. So you might have minor characters, you might have major characters, and then we're going to identify two different types of characters. Protagonists, which are, like I said, the heroic leading characters, or the main character. And then an antagonist, which is, as it sounds, an antagonizing force, somebody who opposes or conflicts with the protagonist. In theory, you could have a non-human antagonist as well. So if you had something like a supernatural force that was haunting the main character, that could be like an antagonizing force that's, I guess, supernatural. Like, it's not necessarily a character. It could be more of an abstract, presence in the text. So it kind of just depends whether there is an antagonist or not, and whether that's a human antagonist or another force, or even society could be an antagonist, right? So you sometimes have to think outside of the box in terms of what is a character. And then the term characterization refers to all the ways that we can describe or attribute features or attributes or behaviors or characteristics, personality, all of that to the character. So it's all of the details that the story contains that helps us understand who that person is, why they're doing what they're doing. It could be the manner of how they talk. It could be how they dress, how they're described, their physical appearance, or it could be little things like how they interact with others. But it's who you are, it's who that character is, all of those details that play into and paint the portrait of that person. So that's what characterization is. So all the physical and non-physical descriptions or details about that character. Okay, so up next. Oh, and in our little image here, I'll just explain there's some various protagonists here. Like, you know, Harry Potter is obviously the main protagonist of the Harry Potter series. Indiana Jones is the protagonist of the Indiana Jones series. Antagonists, Joker, obviously the antagonist to Batman. He's the main villain. And you have, you know, a good interplay or good conflict created between protagonists and antagonists in a lot of stories. But we'll talk more about conflict as another literary key term in a moment. Okay, so up next we have setting, genre, theme, and conflict as 4 more key terms in literature. Let's start with setting. So setting is the time and place in which the story is set. But it is also where it is set. Is it an internal space? Is it inside a home? Or is it external? Is it out in the wild, in the trees, or in the city? It could be urban, rural settings. It could also include weather. You know, is it extreme conditions of cold or hot? And the cultural surroundings. So what is the historical context? What is society like at that time and place in which this story is taking place? So setting is very important. It can determine, you know, what kind of life the main character leads, whether they're restricted or not in their choices, because society or the circumstances of their surroundings can really limit you or, you know, empower you depending on what your environment allows you to do. So there might be a change of scenery or change of setting as the story goes on. You know, a character might occupy one place at the start of the book and then move to another setting. And those settings are not unimportant. They're very important, right? So there's a lot of meaning and purpose that we can read into the setting of a story. And the next one is genre. And this is really, it's almost too big to explain in this short definition, but there's so many layers to genre that you can unpack. But in just general terms, a genre is a category of literature identified by its form, so how it is written, its content and style. The main 3 genres of literature are poetry, prose, and drama, but I would also add in there nonfiction as a kind of prose. So you could have fiction, nonfiction, different styles of prose writing. Poetry, as you know, is usually more poetic and more abstract language, shorter text. Differs from, you know, reading a novel or short fiction story, right? So reading a book versus reading a poem, they have different forms and the style of them differ as well. So you kind of have to know whether you're studying a poem, a fiction or nonfiction text of prose, or is it a drama, a play meant to be read and performed. So every genre of writing has its own conventions and stylistic norms. So when you look at our large, you know, handout for key terms, you can sort of make note that some of these apply to literature, some of them apply to poetry, some of them apply to drama, but there's also going to be some overlap, I guess, between genres as well. So prose writing can include poetic language. Drama can include, you know, plot structure like a story, all those things. So there is like overlapping layers. Poetry can also be very narrative based. It can tell a story, but it's doing it in poetic form. Poetry writing also contains sometimes rhyme schemes and meter, so it's specifically rhythm based and meant to be sort of read out loud or recited as poems are. And prose writing can, you know, mimic our thoughts, the way that we think and write. It can be usually written in complete sentences. whereas poetry can be more abstract and unconventional and break some of those grammatical rules. So it's important to, again, familiarize yourself with different types of genre and be able to identify what a poem is, what prose is, what a drama is, what nonfiction is versus fiction. So you kind of have to know those basic genres. And then we have the term theme. And again, theme is hard to explain as well, but it encompasses like overarching meaning of a text. It's kind of the message or meaning behind a piece of literature. It's usually like the author's, main message or idea behind, or what they're trying to convey throughout the text. So here it's defined as the central idea, topic, or point of a story or essay is its theme. So it is the sort of overarching idea. And there could be more than one theme in every text. But it is kind of, you could ask yourself, what does this text mean? Why am I reading it? Why does it matter? What is it trying to say? Those are kind of the questions that you can ask yourself when you're reading something, like, what is the point of this? And decide, what the author was trying to convey through this piece of writing. So that's kind of what's tricky about writing, is sometimes you don't know, so you have to sort of piece together what the theme is, what the overarching message or meaning of that text is. And all of these literary devices help build on theme, usually. So you'll have the setting will relate to the theme. The characters will help build the theme. All of these things sort of work in unison to create a kind of unified message or meaning of a text. So they're not just separate little things that a story has. They all kind of work together in unison. And then we have conflict. This one's a little bit more straightforward. So every story, every work of fiction needs to have some kind of conflict in order to propel the characters forward through the plot or the storyline or narrative. So they have to have some sort of struggle, tension, disagreement, a problem. Something has to come up in the story to upset the balance and then set the character on a narrative arc of discovery or whatever it is that they're trying to do. So a conflict can be in many different forms. There's 4 types here in this little illustration. So it could be man versus man. So that's a kind of interpersonal conflict that you or that character has with another character. So they might oppose each other. They might even get into like physical fighting. You could also have a conflict man or woman versus nature. So they, like I was saying, you can have an abstract antagonist, something that is not a person, but rather a force. So it could be the environment around them as a kind of antagonizing or conflicting force that they're facing. You can also have internal conflict. So it could be a character who is internally conflicted about a decision, or they might struggle with their own identity or sense of self. They might have mental health issues and deal with depression or anxiety or anything like that and have sort of an internal conflict. So that could also be a type of conflict. And then the 4th one is man versus society, or woman versus society, where you have that conflict with the larger social forces that are in effect. So society can be very oppressive, controlling, and limiting. And then an individual can be very, ambitious and want more in life than what society has given them. So there can be that push-pull or conflict between self and society that a text can illustrate. So like this said, like I tried to mention that it's man or a woman or whoever, an individual, even genderless individual, right? So it doesn't really matter the gender of the person. It's a universal conflict, right? Conflict is universal in all texts. And like I said, the antagonist can be a person for interpersonal, but it can also be something other than a person. Okay, and then up next we have plot, allegory, and symbolism. So plot is probably the one you're most familiar with. Every story, film, TV show has some kind of plot. It's the basic storyline or plot line. Sometimes it's called the narrative, which is just a kind of literary term for story or storyline. And usually a plot or storyline follows a beginning, middle, end, but that doesn't necessarily also always have to be. Sometimes a narrative might have a very open-ended ending that seems really inconclusive, but it's the author's choice to sort of leave you hanging, unsure of what's to come next. Filmmakers have also played around with the beginning, middle, end. Sometimes they start at the end and work their way backwards. There's lots of creative ways that plot structure can be reimagined in creative ways. But basically, at its basic level, it's the sequence of the story. And you might pick out like plot points. What are the important moments or events over the course of a narrative that mark that character's journey? So that could be, how you might interpret a story is by those significant events over the course of time, from the beginning of the story all the way to the end. And then the next term is allegory. And this one's maybe a little bit more abstract or difficult to understand. It's kind of like a large metaphor. So if you understand what a metaphor is, an allegory is basically like that, but bigger, and extends over the whole text. But a metaphor, as I'll remind you, is, comparing one thing to another. So, my love is like a red, red rose is a form, well, that's actually a simile, but you get the point. It's a comparison between two different things. So an allegory kind of does that, but on a larger scale, and it's sort of this extended metaphor that hangs over the whole text. So it could be a poem, it could be a short story, it could be a novel. So an allegory can be applied to any of those things. But it refers to any story that has this deeper or layered meaning where the characters or actions symbolize something else. So there can be levels to the story. On the level, there's sort of a basic surface level story, but then there's this other deeper layered meaning that is often historical, biblical, or has a sort of other relationship to something, sort of like a meta-narrative, like a bigger narrative than itself. So for example, in this childhood rhyme, ring around a rosy, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. So it's like a little childhood rhyme. And it's on the surface, little kids running around in a circle, holding hands, and they're, it sounds like they have flowers and they fall down and it's all fun. But the reality, the allegorical meaning tells us that Ring Around the Rosie is really about the spread of disease during the Great Plague of London in 1665, and that, all fall down in the rhyme is a symbol of death, or allegorically is referring to the death of the plague, people dying from the plague. So allegory is really kind of interesting, and you can go really deeper into a text when you find some allegorical meanings. And Science fiction is a great place to start for allegory, um, like even something like Avatar is very allegorical because it has, on the surface, it's a story about aliens and, invading this alien planet, but it has an allegorical sort of connection to the history of colonialism and how, settlers appropriated and took over the land and then exploited it. So there's this sort of historical allegory of colonialism that makes Avatar maybe a more interesting movie because of that connection. But there's other texts, you might have read Animal Farm in your high school, and that one has to do with sort of animals taking over a farm. That's the sort of surface level story. But the historical allegory is really the novel or the author's retelling of the Russian Revolution, where animal characters stand in place for real historical figures like, Stalin and Lenin and all of these Russian revolutionaries. So there's a literal meaning, a very surface level, and then there's a deeper historical / biblical connection that you can make. The biblical one you might be familiar with, like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The character of Aslan, the lion, who is killed and then reborn, is sort of a Christ figure. So biblical connections in texts are also allegorical. And then another key term is symbolism. So this refers to usually an object that has more of an abstract or larger meaning attached to it. Usually it's an object that you can hold and touch, like something physical, material, like, a wedding ring or a red rose or, a clock, a watch, something like that that's mentioned in the story that has a larger meaning or significance to it. And sometimes the meaning is obvious and sometimes it's not, but usually this object will become sort of an important part of the story that we can read into why it's symbolic or important. In some cases, you could have color symbolism. So in like a Little Red Riding Hood, the color red might be symbolic, right, of a certain idea or feeling. So the color red can represent anger, it could represent danger, it can represent passion, all of these things, violence, bloodshed. So colors can be symbolic, but also objects, things. If a wedding band is a symbol of love and eternal love, it's a perfect circle. So a circle could be sort of a symbol of eternity as well. So all of these little details in a story you can pull out and analyze. And that's kind of one of the fun things about reading literature is everything has meaning in it, even little tiny details. And then lastly, I just want to briefly go over the Freytag's pyramid. And we'll talk about this a couple times over the course of the term, but it's the basic plot structure for a lot of literature. And there's 6 parts to Freytag's pyramid, and this is the basic beginning, middle, end of a story. And it usually follows this kind of pattern. But the exposition refers to all of the basic explanation of who the characters are, where the story is set, the time and place, and it sets up the basic information, the background story of the characters, and all the information that we kind of need to know in order to understand what's happening in the story. But things like, who the character is, what their name is, what their relationships are, what their life is like up to this point, And any other background information we need to know about them is the exposition. And then there has to be some sort of conflict arising, and we call that the inciting incident. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as the complication, or inciting incident. It's sort of basically the same thing, but something has to happen in the story in order to, again, create conflict and create progress or change in the story. So it gives the protagonist or the main characters something to do, sets up the action of what's going to happen. And so when the inciting incident happens, that sets the story into action and things start happening. So these are kind of parts of your plot points through the rising action, and there's usually a build-up of tension or build-up of different events that occur throughout a story, you know, creating character development and also just leading the protagonist to a certain moment. And that's where we get to the most climactic moment. It could be a moment of crisis, a moment of change, a turning point. It's called the climax because it reaches a peak of sometimes a turning point or an exciting moment of that happens in the story. But usually what happens after that, you know, there's some sort of change in the main character. They're not the same person that they once were, that they started as. So this climax changes the life of the individual forever. And after the climactic turning point, we have the falling action. So that's kind of what happens as a result of this climactic moment. And then usually there's some sort of resolution or ending to the story. It's the new norm that's been created. So it's not the same as they started. There's going to be some sort of change to create a new normal for these characters. And sometimes this is called the denouement. That's just a sort of fancy French term for it, but we usually just use a resolution. So there could be a moral to the story, you know, like you have a resolution is some sort of moral lesson. Sometimes the author leaves it open-ended, so you have an open resolution or open ending. But there'll be some sort of change in the life of the protagonist as a result of everything that they've gone through over the course of the story. So it's just a good idea to familiarize yourself with these key terms because we'll be coming across them again in our studies. But that's it for this video, so I'll let you guys review some of these key terms and also look at the handout for key terms in this course.